So as populations age, your economy has to turn over unless you have a large bulwark of young people that is constantly growing to take up more of the slack, the economic slack, to pay for these folks who have different lifestyles, more savings, and different needs, specifically healthcare. That's China's enormously big problem.
Although China is known as one of the biggest and most prosperous economies in the world, it is not a secret that currently it has its own problems in the economy. Experts are turning more bearish about China's economy, downgrading their growth forecasts further for 2022 and seeing lingering risks into next year, as turmoil in the property market and COVID outbreaks persist. Besides that, China has yet another problem it has to face, the staggering decline and aging of population. In this video, Chamath explains how this population problem in China can be devastating to its economy. Also, in the end we will discuss the ongoing diplomatic expansion between China, Russia and Saudi Arabia and how this growing bond between giants can affect United States, which might have accidentally propelled the need for relations between mentioned countries. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video, feel free to drop your comments down below and don't forget to subscribe to not miss any more content that we provide. Thanks again and enjoy the video.
At a very macro level, China has one massive problem, which is one of population. It's hard to get an accurate count, but it is an aggressively aging population, which was the result of the one child policy for a very long time. China has sort of been on their heels trying to adapt that policy. But really, the last data I saw, I tweeted this out. It was a little while ago, Nick, so it may be hard for you to find in my Twitter feed, but it was a projection of China's population, which essentially showed it contracting by almost 50% by 2100. So that's a really bad situation. Now, when you have a slowing population, then the economy has to morph. Why is that? When you have a young population, so for example, take what China was 20 years ago when it entered the WTO, or what India is today, when you have lots of young people, you can on-ramp them into economically productive activities like manufacturing. The problem when those folks accumulate middle-class income and wealth is that they age out of those kinds of jobs, like they did in America. And what we seek are services and service-level jobs. And you spend more money, you spend it in a different way. So as populations age, your economy has to turn over unless you have a large bulwark of young people that is constantly growing to take up more of the slack, the economic slack, to pay for these folks who have different lifestyles, more savings, and different needs, specifically healthcare. That's China's enormously big problem. So when you see them talking about 6% GDP targets and you think, how does a country that big even grow at 6%? It's because they're reverse engineering for what they need to create economic vibrancy in that country. And so when you start to look at 2%, which in America you'd say 2%'s great. We would like high-fiving each other for 2%. That's not a sustainable level of growth for what's happening inside that country. It does not create enough of expansion economically to cover all these folks. That is a really big issue. So as that happens, I think what we need to do is figure out how to be competitive. Now, this goes all the way back to our first conversation. Subsidies don't make us more competitive. Things that governments can do to make us more competitive are long-term, drawn-out tax incentives that change the earnings capacity of companies. Why? Because then the capital markets reward those businesses. Jason, you just mentioned it. Why is the Chinese capital markets in difficulty? Nobody knows what the long-term earnings are. How do you forecast it? It's not simple anymore. It's not a model. It's not an interest rate. It's not a discounted set of cash flows, right? And so that's how they need to refactor themselves. They need to have a much larger population. If you don't have that, you have to figure out how to do it with immigration. If you don't have that, what China has done is they've tried to go to Southeast Asia and to Africa, and they've tried to create that synthetic form of a growing pyramid, right? Now that can work as long as the balance sheet of the country supports that, because ultimately you're still talking about moving money offshore. Okay. So I think they're in a little bit of they're in a pretty difficult spot.
Another important instance in the world is the strengthening ties amongst Russia, China, and Saudis, as Saudi Arabia considers trading oil in yuan instead of dollars. This economic tie-up could affect the US dollar and the importance of it on the global economic stage. Amongst all that, it is reported that Russia together with China is planning to host military exercises in Russia. Naturally, the question is, can this strengthening alliance pose any significance to US, and should we be changing our tactics on foreign policy? Let's dive into the discussion on the All In podcast to uncover the answers.
Biden's backing away from this now, but in his first year, he declared the Saudis to be pariahs, and he did push them into China's arms. What was the point of that? Biden recently had to go to the Middle East to basically beg Saudi Arabia to increase their production of oil. So he's already acknowledged that the policy didn't work. And one of the reasons it didn't work is because simultaneously with declaring these allies to be enemies, he basically restricted U.S. energy production, which is, strategically undermined.
And the U.S. has military bases in Saudi Arabia. Very strategic assets for the U.S. military.
Yeah, listen.
And we sell them weapons.
The U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia is always going to be complex. They're a complicated friend to have. But it's much better to have them as a friend than basically drive them into China's arms. And the reality is, whatever you think about the regime there and how oppressive it is, first of all, we don't get to choose the people running these countries. That's the lesson we should have learned over and over again from all these failed regime change operations. Second, do we have any reason to believe that if that regime got toppled, it would get replaced with something better? I think we all know that if the regime there fell, it would probably be replaced with something fundamentalist that we would like even less. And certainly if another nation were to basically dominate the region, like Iran, that would be worse for us as well. So our relationship with them is complicated, but ultimately they should be, I think, allies of the United States, and we should not be working overtime to push them into China's arms. And I think similarly with Russia, we've basically declared ourselves to be engaged in this proxy war with Russia, which strategically, there's just nothing in it for us. You can sympathize with the people of Ukraine all you want, but it's dangerous.
You've said that in the past. I think the question is, does this China military exercise in Russia indicate an escalation of our conflict with China to you? Or is this something that, is just kind of par for the course in terms of, neighbors, conducting? Mearsheimer
just had an article in Foreign Affairs talking about the Ukraine war, reminding us that it's still going on. I think people somehow think that this war is just stable and it'll settle into forever war status, kind of like Afghanistan, these conflicts in the Middle East that just went on forever. It's actually very dangerous. It could always escalate out of control. And as long as it's going on, I think we just have to remember that it's going on. It poses a huge global risk. And I would say that one of the things that, again, we should be aware of is this idea that even though we have problems and conflicts with multiple nations, we still don't actually want to push them into each other's arms. Again, the Soviet Union and China during the Cold War being the key example. This principle of geopolitics goes back thousands of years to the Romans, right? Divide et impera, divide and rule. You do not want to unite your enemies. And what we've done here is we keep pushing them together. China and Russia historically have not been friends. They share long borders together. Neighbors generally have problems with each other. These are nations with serious conflicts or differences of interest. And we've made it really easy for China to turn Russia into the junior partner in that relationship.
Chamath, do you think U.S. foreign policy needs to change and that we're setting up this, axis of conflict, this axis of allies that we don't want to have be allies? And, would you kind of advise? And also, do you get concerned about this oil yuan trade where there may be some, economic tie-ups that really could affect, the dollar as a reserve currency?
Look, a couple things. I think it's really dramatic to kind of paint it in these stark kind of like bipolar terms. I think we are post all of that. So I understand how in the Cold War, it was easy to fall into binary definitions of good and evil, 1 and 0, us versus them, team A versus team B. But in 2022, I don't think that's how things work anymore. We're in a highly interconnected, highly global world. It's very complicated. Dollar flows are real time. They're massive. Cooperation is real time. It's all over the world. It's with every country. So it allows every country actually the first chance that they've ever really had to maximize their own potential for their own citizens. And that's really what every country's goal is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so in that lens, look what just happened today. Gazprom said they're going to shut off Nord Stream 1 just for, a few days, right? But as a result of that, EU nat gas has just gone absolutely nuclear and just closed at all-time highs.
14x where it was pandemic.
Right.
Price per unit for year ahead.
So if you take a step back, we are at max energy production with all of the capacity all around the world, 100 plus odd million barrels a day. Okay, global productivity absorbs that. There is very little room right now to expand that without pushing the date in which that capacity is available out until 2028 to 2030. So effectively a decade from now. So if you're in this situation and you're a country with vast natural resources, of which I'll just remind us America is one, I think the most important thing you can do for your own citizens is to monetize these petrochemicals now. Get it out of the ground in a reasonable way. Sell them in the marketplace because there's demand for it. Take that money and reinvest it in your people. And I think if you look at it that way, the best run countries are responding to this moment in time like any company would. How do you maximize demand and sell the product you have to the most number of customers globally? And so I think the Middle East is doing an incredible job. The US, by the way, by passing the IRA, finally, I think, is on the right footing because we can talk about this in a moment, but the path to permitting and the path to clean up. And by the way, it puts fossil fuels on a level playing field with clean energy alternatives.
Emerging alternatives, yeah.
The best thing that could have happened, okay? So I think we're all behaving in a very rational, market-focused way. And so I would focus less on trying to dramatically kind of resolve these things as a few countries versus everybody else. I don't think that's what's happening.
Yeah,
now,
much more complex.
Much more complicated than that. But I think the simple explanation is people with resources in the ground of the country in which they rule have a responsibility, if they believe that there's market demand, to absorb that so that they can take the revenue that comes from it and reinvest it in their people. That is true for the United States. It's true for Saudi Arabia. It's true for every country in the world.
Yeah, Saudi Arabia is clearly making these investments, right? Not just on
and by the way, energy,
but also housing and new industry and education.
And then what do you do with that much money?
Saudi Arabia is becoming much more liberal as a result too, right? The education standards, yeah.
And if you look at the investment, you didn't need to go to Dave Swenson and understand portfolio allocation, although I think the guys in Saudi are smart enough to have probably done it. But if you have a lot of money coming from one kind of business, and you need to make sure that you can diversify so that you can reinvest over a long period of time. If you look at countries that had huge petrochemical related revenue flows, the Nordics, what did they do? They stood up these huge sovereign wealth funds, and those sovereign wealth funds went abroad and they bought all kinds of non-correlated assets to those petrochemicals. That is the same thing that Saudi is doing now.
Financial security for their people.
But it's like, what is the furthest uncorrelated asset from oil? It turns out it's Apple, Facebook, Meta, and Google.
Right. And US treasuries, yeah.
Uber.
Yeah.
And that's it for today. We would also like to know your thoughts. What will the future hold for China? Is the power of influence still in US hands? Or will we soon see a shift of power as countries, like China, Saudi Arabia and Russia, become more connected and therefore less dependent from United States? Leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the content, and we will see you in another video.